Dearest listeners, how peculiar that the most guarded of hearts often surrender to the most unexpected of passions. Today, this author brings you the most achingly poignant tale of grief transformed by devotion, of two souls who sought solitude but found instead a most dangerous temptation. But let us not rush, for the best scandals, like the finest brandy, must be savored slowly. Northamptonshire, 1816. A season of particular melancholy at Blackmore Hall, where shadows lingered despite spring's valiant attempts to brighten its somber facade. The county gentry whispered behind gloved hands about the master of that grand estate, how the once vibrant baronet had become a mere spectre of his former self, haunting his own home with a grief that showed no signs of abating even after 3 long years. One must confess, this author had always held a particular fascination for men transformed by tragedy. Neither wholly broken nor entirely whole, they occupied that most interesting of emotional territories, living with one foot in the present and one firmly planted in the past. The master of Blackmore Hall, however, seemed to exist entirely in the latter, his tall frame perpetually cloaked in black, his once laughing eyes now as cold and gray as December skies. This author has it on good authority that his transformation occurred precisely at the moment his beloved wife, Lady Eleanor, drew her last breath while bringing their daughter into the world. The whispers in drawing rooms across the county suggested that he had not stepped foot in the nursery for the first year of the child's life, unable to look upon the innocent cause of his greatest loss. Lady Rutherford pronounced him lost to civilized society with that particular sniff that signaled both judgment and disappointment. This author noticed how the ambitious mamas at county assemblies watched him with calculating eyes despite his forbidding countenance, mentally calculating the value of Blackmore Hall and its extensive lands against the prospect of a husband who had given his heart to the grave. In a modest townhouse in London's respectable but unfashionable Bloomsbury, another soul prepared for a significant change of circumstance. The governess reviewed her meager possessions with the particular care of one who owns little but values each item's significance rather than its worth. The letter offering her the position of governess at Blackmore Hall lay open on her writing desk, the elegant script a stark contrast to the sparse furnishings surrounding it. Would you believe, dearest listeners, that despite her current reduced circumstances, this young woman possessed the bearing and refinement of one born to far greater privilege? The particular grace with which she moved, the impeccable diction and extensive knowledge of languages, music, and the arts, all suggested an upbringing far removed from her present station. This author observed the governess during her final music lesson with the Fortescue girls last Wednesday, her spine straight as a soldier's, her eyes revealing nothing, as Mrs. Fortescue made pointed comments about the expense of a governess with such surprisingly refined accomplishments. One could only admire such composure. What the matrons of Bloomsbury did not know, but this author did, was that beneath her serene exterior, this young woman harbored a carefully guarded secret. Her mother had been a celebrated opera singer, her father not the Italian music master claimed in her carefully constructed history, but one of England's most distinguished nobles. Born on the wrong side of the blanket, she had been raised in comfort and educated alongside legitimate daughters until her father's death left her at the mercy of a new mistress of the house who had no intention of maintaining such an embarrassing reminder of her husband's indiscretion. Two souls, each with secrets they believed well concealed, each with wounds that would horrify polite society, if only polite society could see beyond appearances. How fortunate that your humble chronicler possesses just such an ability. The library at Blackmore Hall, not the grandest in England, but certainly one of the most thoughtfully curated, a testament to generations of scholarly baronets who valued knowledge above display. This author watched with particular interest as the master paced the Aubusson carpet, his agitation evident in the tense set of broad shoulders beneath superfine wool. Gentle listeners, steel yourselves for what transpired next, for even this author, who has witnessed countless first meetings, found herself holding her breath. The governess entered the library with the particular quietness that women in her position cultivate, a skill born of the contradictory requirement to be simultaneously present and invisible. This author noticed how the morning light from the tall windows caught the unusual silver gold of her simply arranged hair, a feature impossible to disguise with modest caps, and one that had undoubtedly attracted unwanted attention in previous positions. More significantly, this author observed the master's reaction, the momentary widening of eyes, the almost imperceptible step backward, as if physically struck by the unexpected beauty before him. What the baronet saw was not merely a suitably qualified governess, though with her flawless French, competent Italian, and extensive knowledge of history and natural philosophy, she certainly qualified, but a disquieting embodiment of feminine grace, draped in drab gray wool. A woman whose quiet dignity and haunting eyes suggested depths of experience at odds with her youth. Or so one might perceive if one were suddenly awakened from a 3-year stupor of grief. This author watched with fascination as the master struggled to maintain his customary detachment during the interview, his questions delivered with the particular crispness that suggested he was battling an unexpected emotional response. The governess, in turn, answered with perfect composure, though this author noted the slight tremor in her gloved hands as she presented her carefully edited letters of reference. The conversation proceeded with perfect propriety. The baronet had always excelled at maintaining appropriate distance, but this author noted how their gazes seemed to meet and then deliberately part, like duelists testing each other's defenses. Neither smiled genuinely. Both maintained careful barriers. And yet, gentle listeners, there was something else. A current of recognition, perhaps. The particular connection that forms between two souls who understand what it means to construct a life around absence. The interview concluded with the master's somewhat abrupt offer of the position, delivered with the particular inflection that suggested he had intended a more measured consideration, but found himself unable to prolong the unsettling encounter. The governess accepted with a slight inclination of her head, her soft thanks carrying that particular quality of gratitude that one expresses when receiving not merely employment, but sanctuary. As the governess was shown to her quarters in the East Wing, this author observed the baronet watching her departure with an expression of bewildered discomfort, as if he had invited not a governess, but a ghost into his carefully ordered existence. In the months that followed, this author observed the most exquisite performance of mutual avoidance that Northamptonshire had witnessed in many a season. The master and the governess encountered each other only when absolutely necessary. During formal meals, when the child dined with her father, during the weekly reports on educational progress, at church where propriety demanded the household arrive as a unit. One must confess a certain amusement at their elaborate efforts. The baronet, who had previously spent evenings isolated in his library, suddenly developed a keen interest in inspecting the farthest reaches of his estate, precisely when the governess might be expected to use the library to select reading materials. The governess, who had initially suggested daily walks in the gardens for her young charge, inexplicably altered the schedule to coincide with the master's regular business in the nearby market town. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, remarked upon the peculiar timing adjustments to this author during a chance encounter in the village, her voice carrying that particular inflection that indicated she suspected something beyond mere coincidence. This author watched from a discreet distance as the good woman shook her head over what she termed the strange atmosphere that had descended upon the previously predictable household. Yet despite their best efforts, proximity in a country house, even one as substantial as Blackmore Hall, inevitably led to unplanned encounters. This author has it on excellent authority that one evening in late autumn, the master entered the music room unaware that it was occupied, only to find the governess seated at the pianoforte, her fingers coaxing from the instrument a Chopin nocturne of such melancholy beauty that he remained transfixed in the doorway, unable to retreat without drawing attention to his presence. What fascinated this author most was the transformation that occurred in both parties during these accidental meetings. The baronet, so carefully controlled in all other aspects of life, would momentarily display a vulnerability that bordered on anguish. The governess, normally the epitome of propriety, would briefly allow her carefully constructed facade to slip, revealing glimpses of a passionate nature constrained by necessity rather than temperament. The most telling of these encounters occurred during the harvest festival, when the household joined the community celebrations on the village green. This author observed the master's expression when the governess was persuaded to join a group of young women in a traditional folk song. For one unguarded moment, something resembling genuine pleasure animated his austere features. Similarly, when the baronet reluctantly participated in the symbolic cutting of the last sheaf, the governess's practiced indifference slipped, her gaze following his tall figure with an intensity that had nothing to do with an employee's respect for her employer. Later that evening, as the household returned to Blackmore Hall, this author noted the particular tension that arose when the master impulsively offered his hand to assist the governess from the carriage. The momentary contact, gloved hand to gloved hand, lasted no longer than propriety allowed, yet the effect on both parties was as palpable as if they had embraced in full view of the assembled staff. The baronet's sharp intake of breath, the governess's heightened color, the hasty way both withdrew to their respective domains within the house, all betrayed an awareness that extended far beyond the appropriate boundaries of their positions. This author, who had positioned herself near the servants' entrance with remarkable timing, noted the particular concern in the housekeeper's expression as she observed this interaction. The older woman's murmured comment about history repeating itself to the butler suggested knowledge of some previous household complication involving employment and improper attachments. The resistance continued through the changing seasons, of course. At Christmas festivities, they maintained a careful distance. During the long winter evenings when the household gathered for reading or music, they acknowledged each other with the precise degree of civility required. No more, no less. But this author, who has observed human nature through many a season, recognized the particular quality of their performance. They resisted not merely each other, but their growing awareness that in the other's presence, the weight of their respective pasts seemed somehow lighter. The true turning point, dearest listeners, came not during a grand county assembly or formal dinner, but in the hushed stillness of the hall's small family chapel on a snowy February morning. This author, who occasionally finds spiritual contemplation a pleasant diversion from scandal gathering, happened upon the most remarkable scene in that sacred space. The baronet knelt alone before the memorial plaque dedicated to his late wife, his profile etched in shadow against the pale winter light filtering through stained glass. The governess, entering from the side door with a small prayer book in hand, paused upon seeing him, and this author observed with fascination that she immediately began to withdraw, unwilling to intrude upon his private grief. Something changed her mind, perhaps the particular vulnerability in his solitary posture, and instead, she quietly took a seat in the last pew, her head bowed in respectful silence. Minutes passed in this shared solitude until the master, becoming aware of another presence, turned to discover her modest vigil. This author expected immediate withdrawal, consistent with their pattern of mutual avoidance. Instead, something remarkable occurred. The baronet acknowledged her with a slight nod, then gestured to the empty space beside him on the pew. His invitation to share the sacred space came without words, but with a particular openness that had been absent from his countenance since this author had begun observing the household. The governess hesitated briefly before joining him, maintaining a proper distance, yet entering his sphere of solitude by choice rather than chance. They sat in silence before the memorial, both facing forward rather than looking at each other. This author, concealed behind the partially closed vestry door, observed a profound shift in their dynamic. Without the structure of their formal roles, master and employee, they existed simply as two souls sharing a moment of reflection. It was the baronet who finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke of his late wife, not with the bitter grief that had characterized his previous rare mentions of her, but with a gentler remembrance of who she had been in life rather than how she had left it. His quiet admission that he feared his daughter would grow up without knowing her mother's kindness and vivacity revealed a concern beyond his personal loss. The governess listened without interruption, her response when it came delivered with neither presumption nor the careful deference of an employee. She spoke instead with the wisdom of one who understood loss intimately, suggesting that through stories and shared memories, a child could know the essence of a parent never met. Her gentle observation that perhaps the greatest tribute to a loved one lost was to ensure their best qualities lived on in those they left behind seemed to touch something deep within the master. Oh, gentle listeners, this author nearly gasped aloud at the transformation in his expression. To witness the first genuine softening of features so long hardened by resentment, how terribly moving and terribly significant. The baronet's quiet question about the governess's own experience of loss met with a moment of hesitation. Then, with a decision visible in her bearing, she confessed to losing both parents, her mother to illness, her father to circumstances that made acknowledgement impossible. Though she did not reveal her illegitimacy, her careful reference to being removed from the protection of family upon her father's death hinted at painful truths. They sat in silence once more, the ancient chapel bearing witness to this exchange of carefully offered truths. This author observed how they had unconsciously shifted closer, though still maintaining propriety. The master's observation that they were both, in different ways, navigating lives shaped by absence met with the governess's gentle agreement. What happened next, dearest listeners, might seem inconsequential to those who measure connection only in grand gestures. As they rose to leave the chapel, the baronet impulsively reached for the prayer book the governess had set aside, intending to return it to her. As she reached for it simultaneously, their hands met, ungloved in the warmth of the chapel, over the small leather volume. Neither immediately withdrew, the momentary contact extending just beyond what propriety would sanction. This author, who prides herself on discerning the significance of such moments, recognized it for what it was, not an improper advance or a lapse in judgment, but an unplanned connection between two souls who had glimpsed behind each other's carefully constructed defenses. They departed separately, maintaining their public performance of employer and employee. But this author knew, as surely as she knows the difference between true grief and its fashionable imitation, that everything had changed. If this author believed the path to understanding would proceed smoothly from that point, she was soon reminded of the particular talent society has for complicating matters of the heart. 3 weeks after their chapel encounter, during preparations for the spring assembly, disaster struck in the form of Lady Harrington, a gentlewoman whose greatest talent lay in discovering connections between people they preferred to keep hidden. This author watched with growing dismay as Lady Harrington arrived for afternoon tea, ostensibly to discuss the upcoming charity committee, but clearly bursting with fresh gossip. Her remark to the baronet about having recently encountered the Countess of Rendale in London and the Countess's particular interest in his household staff came with that unmistakable glint that suggests malice disguised as social obligation. This author observed the governess's face closely from her vantage point in the adjoining room. The brief flash of alarm, followed by the particular stillness that suggests one is attempting to become invisible. The master, noting this reaction with evident confusion, maintained his composure, though this author detected the slight tension in his posture that suggested protective instincts awakening. Lady Harrington continued with evident relish, noting that the Countess had recognized the name of the governess from correspondence with the previous household where she had been employed. According to Lady Harrington, the Countess had made the most extraordinary claim, that the current governess bore a striking resemblance to the late noble father of the Countess's husband, and furthermore, there had been rumors years ago about this distinguished gentleman's particular attachment to a certain Italian opera singer who had mysteriously retired from the stage around the time a daughter might have been born. Gentle listeners, steel yourselves for what happened next. This author watched as the governess rose from her seat with a murmured request to be excused, her face drained of all color. The baronet, clearly torn between social obligation to his guest and concern for his employee, granted permission with evident reluctance, his gaze following the governess's retreating figure with a mixture of confusion and dawning suspicion. The misunderstanding blossomed like a poisonous flower. To the master, it appeared that the governess had been concealing not merely an unfortunate birth, but perhaps a deliberate deception, that her education and refinement were not the result of a music master's dedication to his daughter, but evidence of a carefully constructed false identity. To those observing, including regrettably your humble chronicler, it seemed the natural conclusion. What the baronet did not yet understand, what this author would only discover later through her particular network of informants, was that the governess's greatest fear was not the revelation of her illegitimacy, but that such a revelation would force her departure from Blackmore Hall, from the child to whom she had become genuinely attached, and from the man whose grief had begun to ease under her quiet influence. In the days that followed, this author observed the most painful of household tensions. The governess withdrew into formal perfection, fulfilling her duties with meticulous care, but retreating from even the smallest personal interactions that had gradually developed. The master, in turn, watched her with increasing frustration, clearly wanting explanation, but unwilling to demand what might humiliate both parties. At the spring assembly, usually a highlight of the county calendar, this author watched the baronet decline invitation after invitation to dance, his attention repeatedly drawn to where the governess sat among the chaperones, her appearance deliberately muted to the point of invisibility. When Lady Harrington deliberately seated herself beside the master and resumed her speculation about the governess's origins, his curt dismissal of the topic surprised even this seasoned observer of social interactions. The situation deteriorated further when the baronet returned from business in London to discover that the governess had applied for a position in another household. Her letter of resignation citing a need to prevent any embarrassment to the Blackmore name. This author, through judicious questioning of the housekeeper, learned of the master's uncharacteristic display of temper upon reading this letter. The violent ringing of the bell, the curt order to have the governess attend him immediately in the library. The greatest tragedy, dearest listeners, was that their separation seemed increasingly inevitable. This author later discovered that the Countess of Rendale had connections to the family who had dismissed the governess from her previous position. A dismissal prompted not by any failing in her duties, but by the master's unwelcome attentions and her refusal to accept them. A tangled web indeed, and one designed to keep this refined young woman perpetually vulnerable, her reputation always balanced on the knife edge of exposure. As March gave way to April, this author observed the governess's increasing pallor, the baronet's growing restlessness. They had found in each other the possibility of healing, only to have it threatened by the very secrets they had kept to protect themselves. But I digress. For the course of true understanding, like that of true love, cannot be permanently diverted by mere misunderstanding. Not when hearts have recognized their counterparts, however briefly. The turning point, dearest listeners, came at the Duchess of Montrose's annual garden party, an event of such social significance that even the baronet, despite his general aversion to society, felt obliged to attend with his entire household, including the governess and his now 5-year-old daughter. The governess arrived dressed with the particular restraint that women in her position adopt for public occasions, her gown of dove gray providing the perfect camouflage among the brightly plumed society matrons. The master, in contrast, stood out in his formal black, his imposing height and striking features drawing appreciative glances despite his forbidding expression. This author positioned herself strategically near the ornamental pond, anticipating developments with the particular thrill that comes when one senses the wheels of fate beginning to turn. The anticipation was not misplaced. The Countess of Rendale, newly arrived from London for the season, approached with the confidence of a woman accustomed to creating scenes rather than avoiding them. This author, through means she shall not disclose, had learned of the Countess's intentions to publicly expose the governess's parentage and thereby remove what she perceived as a threat to proper social order. The Countess began with a tone of false concern, commenting loudly on how difficult it must be for the baronet to find suitable staff for his household, particularly given his daughter's need for proper guidance from someone of appropriate background. This author observed the governess's spine stiffen beneath her modest gown. The young woman had been seated at the edge of the gathering, supervising her charge's exploration of the gardens, but the Countess's deliberately projected voice carried clearly to where she sat. Before the master could respond to this impertinence, the Countess continued, her gaze fixed maliciously on the governess. Her suggestion that perhaps the baronet should know certain facts about his employee's parentage hung in the air like a dropped gauntlet. This author held her breath, wondering if the governess would continue her pattern of dignified retreat, or if the direct attack would prompt a different response. The answer came not from the governess, but from an unexpected quarter. The baronet's daughter, who had been quietly observing from beside her governess, suddenly questioned why the mean lady was saying unkind things about her beloved teacher. Gentle listeners, the tableau that formed in that moment. The countess's face flushed with outrage at being addressed thus by a child. The master's expression transformed from social politeness to paternal protectiveness. And the governess, this author observed with particular interest, placed a gentle hand on her charge's shoulder, neither silencing the child nor encouraging further speech, but offering silent support while facing the countess with remarkable composure. The countess declared with venomous sweetness that the baronet would wish to know that he had invited an illegitimate daughter of noble birth into his household. Her cutting remark about the impropriety of a woman of questionable birth teaching his daughter deportment suggested other unsuitable ideas might be imparted. This author watched with particular delight as understanding dawned across the assembled guests. For a small crowd had gathered, drawn by that particular instinct society has for impending scandal. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the gathering, all eyes turning to the master for his reaction to this bombshell. What happened next occurred with such unexpected grace that even this author, who prides herself on anticipating social drama, could scarcely credit it. The baronet crossed to where the governess stood and, with deliberate care, offered his arm to her. His calm statement that he had known of the governess's parentage for some time came with perfect clarity. The declaration delivered with such conviction that even this author momentarily questioned her intelligence. His additional remark, that the young woman's noble father had been his own father's friend, and that it was his privilege to offer the daughter protection in his household, silenced the gathering completely. Gentle listeners, even this author, who has witnessed countless acts of both cruelty and kindness, felt her heart swell at this declaration, for it was delivered not with reluctant obligation or condescending charity, but with the quiet dignity of a man who had made his choice without reservation. The countess sputtered in confusion, clearly unprepared for this response. Her protest about illegitimacy and the mother's profession as an opera singer of questionable virtue only highlighted her own desperate grasping. The baronet's response came with lethal softness. His acknowledgement of the mother as Sophia Cardini, whose voice had moved his father to tears at Covent Garden, preceded his pointed reference to virtue, specifically questioning the countess's right to raise the subject, given the particular circumstances of her own marriage to her late husband. This reference to the countess's well-known status as her husband's mistress before his first wife's convenient death caused an audible intake of breath from the assembled onlookers. The countess retreated in humiliation, her scheme to publicly shame the governess thoroughly reversed. As the crowd dispersed into murmured speculation, this author observed the master turn to the governess, his expression unguarded for perhaps the first time since they had met. The governess's face reflected disbelief mingled with a dawning hope that transformed her usually composed features. His simple request for forgiveness, not for his words, which he deemed nothing but truth as he saw it, but for not having spoken sooner, met with the governess's response, not in words, but in action. She placed her hand on his offered arm, a gesture that acknowledged both his public defense and the private understanding it represented. This author, not normally moved to emotional display, found herself surprisingly affected by this tableau, for it represented not merely the triumph of honor over malice, but the particular courage required to defy society's judgment, to value a person's true worth over their circumstances of birth. The final act of our tale, dearest listeners, unfolded not in the formal withdrawing rooms of county society or the gossip-filled assembly rooms, but in the tranquil beauty of Blackmore Hall's rose garden on a perfect summer evening. This author, invited to witness the private ceremony as one of a very select group, observed with particular satisfaction as the baronet and the former governess, now Lady Blackmore, exchanged vows beneath an arbor heavy with early blooms. One must confess that even this author, who has chronicled countless unions of necessity and ambition, found herself quite moved by the evident devotion between the couple. They had chosen intimacy over spectacle, sincerity over show, a choice that spoke volumes about their journey from formal distance to profound connection. Dr. Wilson, the family physician who had attended both the master's grief and his recent transformation, remarked upon the progression from reluctant employer to besotted husband, expressing wonder that such healing had been possible. This author, naturally, had imagined it, or at least hoped for it. For what is more satisfying than witnessing two souls find in each other not what society deemed appropriate, but what their wounded hearts truly needed? The scandal that had threatened to destroy the governess's position had in the end proved the catalyst for honesty that both had avoided. The baronet's public defense had evolved, in private conversations that followed, into deeper understanding. His discovery that she had endured not only the pain of illegitimacy, but the vulnerability it created, making her prey to unwelcome advances in previous positions, had awakened his protective instincts first, and then something far more profound. Similarly, the governess's knowledge of his extended grief, initially viewed with proper sympathy, had gradually transformed into admiration for his devotion, then concern for his isolation, and finally, a love that dared not speak its name until circumstances forced both their hands. This author observed with particular pleasure how the baronet's daughter skipped between the newlyweds during the small reception, her joy in this new arrangement evident in every movement. The child had gained not merely a mother, but a father restored to life, his stern features now capable of smiles that transformed him from handsome to nearly irresistible. Lady Blackmore, how delightfully the title suited her, moved through her new role with the particular grace that had always marked her, now enhanced by the confidence of one who has finally found her rightful place. This author noted how the previous restraint in her manner had given way to a quiet radiance, her beauty no longer muted by circumstance, but illuminated by happiness. Near the refreshment table, this author overheard a most illuminating exchange between Mrs. Winters and the butler, the housekeeper's eyes suspiciously moist as she watched the happy couple. "Thank heavens this story had a happier ending than his father's," she murmured, to which the butler nodded with solemn understanding. The cryptic comment confirmed what this author had long suspected, that the current master was not the first Blackmore to recognize worth beyond society's narrow definitions, though perhaps he was the first brave enough to defy convention entirely. The most touching moment came not during the ceremony itself, but after most guests had departed. This author, lingering perhaps longer than strictly proper, but unable to tear herself away from such a satisfying conclusion, observed the master lead his new bride to the small family plot where his first wife rested. There, with gentle reverence, they placed white roses on the grave, the baronet's arm supporting his new wife, not in possessive triumph, but in shared respect for the woman whose absence had shaped both their paths. The governess, now mistress of Blackmore Hall, bowed her head in a moment of silent acknowledgement before looking up at her husband with an expression that promised not to replace what was lost, but to honor it while building something new. One might observe that their path to happiness had been unnecessarily complicated by society's strictures and personal fears. Yet this author would suggest that perhaps the very obstacles they overcame were necessary to forge a connection of genuine strength. Like a sword tempered in fire, their love had emerged stronger for the trials it had endured. As twilight descended on the gardens, this author watched the newlyweds return to the hall, the baronet's hand resting lightly at the small of his wife's back, her head inclined slightly toward him as if drawn by an invisible thread. Not the formal posture of a newly established marital alliance, but the natural gravitation of two people who had discovered in each other the cure for their respective solitudes. And so, gentle listeners, another tale reaches its blessed conclusion. This author withdraws until our next encounter. Until then, remember, the greatest healing often comes from the most unexpected sources. Society will always have its rules and judgments, but true worthiness speaks in steadfast character, in quiet dignity, in hearts that recognize their counterparts despite all obstacles. In the eternal battle between convention and genuine connection, this author shall always favor the latter. Your devoted chronicler, Lady Ravenswood.